Welcome to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone trying to figure out what to do to improve their health through listening to the news. I'm Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health here at the Boston University School of Public Health, and I'm here with Don Thea and Chris Gill, as always, from the Department of Global Health, and we are in the Boston University Godley studio. Before we get started, we want to take a second to remind you about Population Health Exchange, the Boston University School of Public Health's resource hub for lifelong learning. Find out more at www.pophealthex.org. That's www.pophealthex.org, where you'll find this podcast as well as many other population health learning programs and tools. And as always, we just want to remind you, if you're listening on iTunes, go ahead and give us a rating if you can. It will help other people find us, and we'd really appreciate it. I also want to give you a little bit of an update. So I looked online, and it turns out that we have had, over the past 90 days, about 6,000 downloads. So thank you to all those in the audience for supporting us. Now,
from all over the world.
Well, so that's what I was going to go next. So
not
the
just Togo anymore.
Not just Togo anymore. That should be our tagline. Free associations. We're not just for Togo anymore. All right. So the majority are from the U.S., but can you guess where our next biggest download countries are from? We're in the top 5. We're not in Kazakhstan yet. We haven't made the big time yet.
Where the next biggest one is?
Yeah, the next 3 or 4, 5.
It's
Japan?
Nope.
It's
Russia.
No.
Brazil.
UK.
UK is number 3.
Germany.
Germany's number 2.
Oh, wow. France.
Denmark.
Denmark.
And Australia.
Yeah.
Yes.
Denmark.
And presumably the reason Denmark and Germany are places
Because you have family member there.
that I do some teaching
You
in those
traveled
places.
there and downloaded us while you were there.
My wife just told me this morning she's in Tanzania and she downloaded from Tanzania so we could get some download stats
There we go.
for Tanzania. So when you see those online, you'll know that that's her. All right, on to the show. So today, in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment,
We should do a show in Denmark
or Tanzania
for our fans.
I like
we should go on a grand
European tour. Can we afford that? Do we have budget for that?
We have no budget.
I'm pretty sure.
We've got Straits in here.
This is completely budgetless.
In fact, we're not in the Godly studio. We're actually in the back of Chris's car.
Do you know why it is that we have to wash our hands before we come into the Godly studio?
I don't know.
Because cleanliness is next to godliness.
Nick, strike that.
That is so coming out.
Oh, no. Oh, it's terrible. Ouch.
I've been itching to say that for many episodes.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the script here. We're just going to start over.
Back to Tanzania.
Okay.
Awful.
Now, on to the show. Okay, so today in our first segment, our Journal Club segment, I can't. I wish you hadn't done that.
Oh, my pleasure. Right. My pleasure.
We are going to go in a bit of a different direction from usual, as if we haven't already, because we're going to review a study that doesn't actually come from the news, but rather comes from television, which is we're going to look at the study that is the evidence behind a supplement that you can buy online. Supplement is called Prevagen, and we're going to talk about its relationship to improved memory. Then the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive segment, we are going to talk about whether or not industry should be allowed to conduct their own research on products or devices or drugs that they're going to be making a profit off of. And then in our third segment, which is our amazing and amusing, we will get into some things that put a smile on our faces, or Chris will make us wait a very long time before getting to something really interesting, I promise.
What?
Okay.
It's all about the journey.
Let's get into it with our first segment. So
It's
in
a heavy
segment
metal
1,
band, isn't it?
we are going to get into an article that looked at the relationship between a supplement called Prevagen and improved memory. And this is something that we've seen advertised on television quite a bit. And this builds really nicely from one of our previous episodes in which Chris said, I believe the quote was, "Jellyfish ain't babies." Well, we're coming back to jellyfish in this episode. And it builds on
I don't remember that quote.
You don't remember jellyfish ain't babies? Nick, can we get a... Yep, Nick is agreeing.
I don't even remember the context.
You said it.
It's the kind of thing
ain't
I would
babies.
say.
I guess I need some Prevagen.
You may need some Prevagen.
Unless they're jelly babies.
And it builds on our last episode where we were talking about calcium supplement, because this in some way relates to calcium regulation, which we'll get into. Before we begin, so given my recent history of inability to pronounce things, I just want to announce up front that I'm going to be butchering the name of the protein if we talk about it. which I need you guys to help me out with. So what's the name of the compound or protein or whatever it is that we're going to be talking about?
Apoequorin.
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 Seriously, apoequorin.
Or apoequorin.
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 Apoequorin. All right, that's a 50-cent word right there. That is it's a GRE word.
I would not get that one on the GRE.
In fact, I went and looked it up, and if you were to use that word in Scrabble, that's a 22-point word. Now, of course, you couldn't do it because you wouldn't have enough letters, but I did check it out. I also looked it up. It's a word that's never been used in the Scripps National Spelling Bee, at least to date, though I suggest that they use it. All right. So this study was published in the I should say the study that is cited on the commercials for the product. The study that was cited was published in the journal Advances in Mind-Body Medicine in winter of 2016. And this article describes the Madison Memory Study. It's titled The Effects of a Supplement Containing
Apoequorin
on Verbal Learning in Older Adults in the Community. The lead author was David Moran.
Daniel
Moran?
Moran.
Sorry, I apologize. Who is the director of manufacturing sciences at Quincy Bioscience in Madison, Wisconsin.
Which is the organization that produces this product.
And the name of the commercially available supplement for apoequorin is Prevagen. So as noted, this seems to be, as far as I understand, this is a protein that was originally discovered in jellyfish. And so we're not going to get into, in this podcast, I assume, my fears of jellyfish. But I did look it up. It has a WebMD page that describes it. So it says apoequorin is a protein that was obtained in 1962 from a specific type of jellyfish that glows. And when it's exposed to calcium, the protein and calcium bind to blue light. And for more than 40 years, apoequorin has been used to show how calcium works inside cells. Recently, it's been manufactured on a larger scale as a dietarily supplement Prevagen. I have no headlines for this one because it's not a new study, and I don't know that it got any headlines at the time.
Spend 10 minutes watching CNN.
I do know that that's where I hear about it. I hear about it when I'm at the gym.
It's the jellyfish
on
drug.
The treadmill, and I hear this announcement for Prevagen, which always reminds me of the Saturday Night Live take on when they did their takeoff on CNN, and they say, "You're watching CNN, so be careful on that treadmill."
Oh, that's funny.
Okay, so Don, let me start with you and tell us what they did and what they found in this study. And specifically, I want you to answer whether or not, if this is true, I can just go to the source and just eat jellyfish.
Oh, that's a bad idea.
Bad idea?
That's a bad idea.
Don't eat jellyfish. Got it.
Oh, the Japanese eat jellyfish.
Absolutely.
I've had jellyfish.
No, absolutely. I looked it up. I actually got some recipes.
It's not so great, but it's not so bad.
It's also difficult to cook because it's mostly water.
Yeah, you have to eat it raw.
We are slightly on a tangent.
Slightly. All right. So as Matt mentioned, this article was published
2016, winter.
2016 in Advances in Mind-Body Medicine. And these authors, as Matt mentioned, who are also happen to be principals in the company, conducted this study. And in the paper, they cite an untested hypothesis, which is the calcium hypothesis of brain aging. And they cite some preliminary evidence and in vitro evidence seems to indicate that high levels of intracellular calcium have a deleterious effect on nerve cells. And that's something that has been observed in vitro or in test tubes in the laboratory. And they reasoned that if one could reduce the level of calcium intracellularly in neurons, then they might do better. They might live longer. They might last longer. And one of the things that they cite is a study that looked at the oxidative stress of hippocampal neurons in vitro, and that this product apparently made those neurons a little bit easier to tolerate that kind of oxidative stress. They also, these same authors, previously published an article in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior. When was this? This was in 2015. Where they looked at the title of that paper is A Novel Mechanism of Cognitive Enhancement in Aged Dogs with the Use of Calcium Buffering Proteins. And what they did is they identified dogs with cognitive dysfunctional syndrome. And these are dogs that are older and they are, I guess, fairly poorly behaved. And they gave these dogs not in a randomized fashion, but not in a placebo-controlled fashion, 2.5 milligrams of this substance, and then they did a bunch of sort of veterinary memory tests, and they were able to seemingly show that there was some improvement in the behavior of the dogs. And based on that, they decided that they would go ahead and test this in humans.
Okay.
So that's the paper we're going to talk about. So what they did was by use of flyers in Madison, which is the area surrounding where the manufacturers is they sent out flyers and they got volunteers who self-identified as people who are concerned with or having problems with their cognition in terms of memory and stuff. And they were community dwelling adults. They weren't institutionalized adults. They were of very wide range of ages, from I think 40 to 95 years old. And they enrolled them. And the inclusion criteria was a history of that they were healthy, that they were between 40 and 95, that they had concerns about their memory loss, and that they were able to comply, that the authors felt that they would be able to comply with the rigors of the study. The exclusion criteria were that they could not have had a history of significant neurological disease. They did not have memory impairment disorders, major depressive disorder, uncontrolled medical condition, history of hypersensitivity to the medication, or in the investigator's opinion, that the subjects would be unlikely to comply with the protocol. So they identified 221 subjects who they assessed at baseline with a screening test called the AD8, which is a screening interview, which essentially categorized all of these subjects into either no or very mild cognitive impairment or worse cognitive impairment. It was based on a 0 to 5 point scale. So anybody that scored 0 to 1 or 0 to 2 on that 5 point scale were considered to have minimal or no cognitive impairment. And they then proceeded with doing their study on all of the individuals that had been recruited, those who had mild impairment as well as those who had more severe impairment. And they randomized these individuals 3 to 2. So 3 individuals were in the exposed group and 2 were in the placebo group, although they don't really mention very much about the actual randomization procedure. And what they did is they instructed people to take 1 pill of this Prevagen every day for 90 days. And what they then did was that they applied this battery of tests, a battery of 9 cognitive tests to individuals over, I think it was 30, 60, 90 days. And then they did the analysis at 90 days. And the intent was to look at what was the difference in a bunch of memory and executive functioning measures in individuals or in groups between what was observed at 90 days and what was observed at baseline. It was placebo-controlled. They state that the pills that they used looked and tasted identical. The placebo contained rice flour, and the experimental medicine contained 10 milligrams of rice flour and 10 milligrams of Prevagen, and then the rest rice flour. So apparently they were unable to distinguish this. The analysis was pretty standard. They did paired and independent t-tests. They did repeated measures analysis of covariance, and the covariance that they used in that analysis was what were the baseline differences between the groups. And as far as the results are concerned, really the first line of the study kind of says it all. I mean, the first line of the results section kind of, in my opinion, says it all. It says, essentially, they said there was no difference when they looked at the results of these nine cognitive tests when they included all of the individuals. However, what they did notice when they did their subsequent analyses was that if they drilled down into the group that had mild cognitive impairment, that group that at baseline had 0 to 2 in terms of this 88 score, and
so the healthier ones,
and they looked at only 2 of the 9 various cognitive tests, that they claimed to have found a difference. And that difference implied that the people who had been taking this product had increased ability to recall something called the ISL, which is the International Shopping List, where they give you a list of sort of random objects that you would find on your shopping list, and then they ask you what was on that list 25 minutes later. And they did that sequentially at those various times over time. And they did that for the International Shopping List, and then I think it's the International Shopping List recall.
Right. In which they did it 25 minutes later, and you had to do the same thing.
Right.
Remember the same
So
list.
variation on the same thing. But then there were these other 7 tests that they did for the entire group, as well as for this subgroup, and they don't really report on those. And it's important to I think, to state that the group that they're reporting on comprise a small subset of the larger group. And in fact, only 43% of the accrued subjects are really described in this analysis and are described as having this effect.
Yep. Okay. All right. So, Chris, let me then turn it over to you. And can you give us your take on this study? What were the pros and the cons, and what's your ultimate? Well, we can come back to what your ultimate decision on it is.
Okay. Well, so when we're with our students, we tend to go through a sort of a systematic approach to looking at the results of clinical trials and randomized controlled trials specifically. And so I'd just like to apply that construct here and sort of say, if this was a test case for students, how would we approach this? And I would say, okay, you've got a randomized controlled trial. So what you want to know, first of all, is what is the primary endpoint of the study, and has that been pre-specified? And in this case, it does not appear to have been pre-specified. You would like to see that the primary aim is built around some sort of statistical power assumptions, and there are no power assumptions in this paper. You would like to see that if this is a randomized trial, that the randomization succeeded in randomizing the subjects. And normally we do that by looking at the table 1, which looks at the baseline demographics of the participants. And they really don't do that. They tell you their sex and their age, and that is all the information we have about these individuals. And so that is completely skipped. And since this is alleged to be a blinded trial, we would like to see what was the method used for blinding, but they don't tell us. We would like to know if this was double blind, exactly how did they blind the subjects and how did they blind the people who were doing the ascertainment and collecting the data. And they don't explain either of these except to describe the construction of the pills,
right?
Which is part of the blinding strategy, but it is not a complete description. It's not an adequate description of the blinding. And similarly, you would like to see some evidence, as we did in a paper I think we reviewed a couple of weeks ago, providing some empiric evidence that the blinding was successful. I think that what was the study we did where some people were queried at the end. Did you know which? It was the stent study.
Right.
Did you know which group you had been randomized to?
Right.
People could not tell, and so that is good evidence that the blinding was successful. And so they did not do that here. Now, so right away, my Epi 101 first semester MPH students checklist, they have struck out on every single category here. And in addition, I think we would like to see that the study was based within some context of biological plausibility. And so we've got this very interesting apoaquarin protein, which causes jellyfishes to glow when the calcium is present, and this interesting protein substrate called silenterazine is present. When you put those together, it releases blue light, and it is very cool. But that does not, and it is through calcium, but that does not mean that this is a solution to dementia. Now, there have been animal models and in vitro models where they've shown that dysregulation of calcium in neurons is associated with older neurons. So there is some plausibility that changes in
vitro,
calcium,
not in vivo.
Right, in vitro, excuse me. There's some plausibility that calcium is involved somehow in aging of neurons. But with that said, calcium in the body is involved in everything. Everything.
So you're saying that alone doesn't mean anything?
So that doesn't put it into a unique category. Everything is related to calcium in the body because it is a second messenger for practically all biological processes. So this is useless information. And then if this were to work, right, you'd have to have some reason to believe it would work beyond this experiment that was done in dogs, which does not persuade anybody. So for it to work, though, you'd say, okay, the protein has to be absorbed intact into the bloodstream. So you swallow this pill, and the apoequorin protein has to not be digested by stomach digestive juices. And in one of these safety studies that they cite on their website, it describes the chemical properties of apoequorin, and it turns out that it is exquisitely sensitive to pepsin, which is the primary digestive enzyme secreted by the stomach. First contact with the body is a bath in pepsin, which will turn apoequorin into a slurry
love the word,
of individual amino acids. So assuming that doesn't happen, and there's no reason to believe that because they've never shown that it's absorbed intact, it then is now in the bloodstream. We assume it's gotten into the bloodstream somehow. It then has to get across the blood-brain barrier. And what we know about the blood-brain barrier is that it allows very small molecules like oxygen and water to pass freely, and that larger molecules like sugars and amino acids are transported through active mechanisms that regulate their protein. But larger proteins like antibodies cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. And the very few large molecules that can are highly lipophilic, which means that they like to embed themselves in lipid membranes, in fatty membranes. And apoequorin is hydrophobic, which means it is within that category of proteins that is almost exclusively systematically excluded from crossing the blood-brain barrier. And so none of this makes any sense. And then we get into the data. And I'd like you to talk about that. So before we even look at the actual results of the study, the whole thing already feels to me like this doesn't make any sense.
You were buying
I'm not buying
the logic for why we should think this would work in the beginning. All right, so then let's get into the data. So I want to go back to a point that, Don, you raised, which is you mentioned these 9 outcomes. Where did you get this idea that there were 9 outcomes?
There were a battery of 9 tests.
Where'd you get that? Because that's not in the paper, I don't think. Is it? That's from the online report.
That's correct.
Yeah. So the actual paper
I'm
itself
sorry, you're right. That's right.
doesn't actually mention. It just mentions these 2.
Right.
It mentions the international shopping list, and the international shopping list
but the supplementary materials available online gives us lots more information.
Yeah.
Which they don't tell us about.
But it doesn't seem to make it into the published paper.
Which doesn't make it into the paper. And if you go and look at the online version, presumably the reason, and this goes back to what we talked about in our second segment from our last podcast, is presumably the reason that none of those other ones make it in there is because none of the rest of them are statistically significant. And this is part, again, going back to my statistical significance.
Not that we'd ever poo-poo that. Just
No, I'm saying that statistical significance doesn't...
Or PP that?
It's not the pro and the con of
the yin and yang?
It's not the thing that should determine what we...
Include and not include.
Include and not include. But if you're going to use it, the idea that if you have lots of outcomes, you have lots of lots of different measures that you use, and then you find a connection between one of the measures and your exposure, but none of the others, it's fair to start to ask, is that real or is that just chance? We just, we did a whole bunch of tests. No, they only did 9. So let's say we did 100 tests, and a few came up positive. You'd expect that just sort of by
the 1 in 20 chance.
Yeah. And so, they didn't do 100. I'm not saying they did. They did 9, but they only found one that was significant. Now to further that along, as Don points out, they didn't actually find this statistically significant relationship, which is what they're so focused on here, in the entire data, in the entire small number of subjects who were in this study, which is 218, which is not a lot of people to be in a study to begin with. They found it only in the subset of data, as you said, of the healthy participants, which is only about half the data. So now you're telling me we're going to carve this data up in half, and there I find a benefit in the healthy group.
In a subset of the outcomes.
In a subset of the data.
Right.
Okay, so that starts feeling a little bit more like maybe that's just a chance finding.
Mm-hmm.
If you find, remember, if you take all the data, you're essentially averaging together all the outcome data across these 2 groups, the healthy group and the sick group, which suggests to me that if you find a benefit in the healthy group, there's probably, and you didn't find a benefit overall, there's probably some suggestion of harm in the unhealthy group. When you average those together, you get back to
No effect.
Nothing.
no effect.
Right.
But you take out one subset and benefit. Now, it doesn't always have to be that way, so I should say I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because even in the online report, which presents a lot more of the data, they never present the data on the 3 to 8 category, whatever it is, the sick group.
Right.
And so without that, it's very hard for me to say that I don't think that this is just sort of a chance, potentially just a chance finding.
Yeah.
Further to that point, the statistics in this paper are just odd. I mean, this is, I think I used the phrase last time, but this is littered with p-values. It's just riddled with p-values, might be another way to say it. There's p-values everywhere, and such that they don't actually make a lot of sense. So what they've done is, one of my pet peeves in general is, when you present data, you want to present the data first. Then you want to present any comparisons that you do. They don't actually present the data here. They only present the change from baseline in the scores for the number of things you could remember on the shopping list.
As a percentage.
As a percent change. So they all start at 0%, which says, I'm just going to assume that at baseline, both groups are equal, regardless of whether or not they were.
You can't assume that. It may not be true.
It may not be true. Now, they have a statistical way of dealing with that, but that's not what they present here in their figures. They just sort of say, let's look at the change from baseline in each of the groups, even if the groups were different at baseline. And so you find a 10% increase in the group that got the Prevagen, let's just say, in the 0 to 2 group, and a 3.79% increase in the group that didn't. So that's an absolute difference of about 7%, if you assume they started at the same place. Okay, 7%. The average score on this checklist was about 24. So a 7% increase on a score of 24. Does that mean they remembered
Like a point.
One
and a half.
additional item?
one, maybe 2 additional things? Does that have any clinical meaning? I'm not sure it does. I don't really know, but it's, without knowing a lot of the details here, without more information, it's very hard to draw any conclusions that this is anything but, presumably potentially just a chance findings. I wouldn't put a lot of weight into this without more evidence, and I certainly wouldn't. Without more trials, say that I could conclude anything from this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And another thing that is a little bit perplexing about this is the sort of lack of a clinical hook in terms of what do these numbers mean. So in the statistical analysis section, they talk a lot about this statistic called the Cohen's d, which I was not familiar with. I had to go onto the Wikipedia website to look it up, which informed me that Cohen's d is a way of getting a standardized effect size.
The statistical test of
A statistical
Cohen's d.
test, right.
Yeah.
But it is based purely on an analysis of standard deviations, which is separate from clinical relevance.
Absolutely.
It is simply a statistical feature of the shape of the data, but it doesn't tell you anything about the magnitude of the effect from the patient's perspective. Like, just because the Cohen's d is big, little, or small does not mean the patient will experience a big, little, or small benefit. It has the two phenomena are completely delinked. You could have a Cohen's d of 1, which is, I think, it's not the best, but it's like a very high, what they consider to be a very high effect, and yet that could translate into no perceptible difference on the part of the patient. So you got to ask yourself, why would they do it that way? Why don't you, if you're trying to set up the study, if you really wanted to figure out whether this thing worked, you would want the patients to be reporting their benefit from it, and you would report those data in your results section to emphasize the clinically relevant response to this product. Instead, they've gone to a statistically uninterpretable measure of effect, which I find to be a little bit of a dodge and weave.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd go that far. I don't share that same sentiment. I certainly don't think it was a dodge and weave. I don't think it has to be, I should say. I mean, the Cohen's d is a legitimate statistical test that people do use. I'm not a fan, but more to the point, I'm not the fan of testing, right? I want to know about the size of the effect and the confidence interval around it. And there's not a single confidence interval in this paper, and there's almost no effects. In fact, when they talk about effects, what they're talking about is Cohen's d, but that's, as you said, that's just a normalized value.
standard
It doesn't
deviations.
tell you anything. What was the actual
Effect size.
difference that an individual could remember? And that's never presented in this paper, which I find, makes it very, very difficult to interpret whether or not I would ever put any weight into this.
Yeah, and I think that one of the graphs in the paper that we have in front of us is a histogram, which is a bunch of bars that look at the effect size over time and the effect size between the placebo group and the intervention group. And it goes, the one set of bars goes up, and what we're saying is that it's going up to a degree that may be statistically significant if you use a fancy test, but has marginal to no significance in terms of its potential effect in an individual. But that's the graph that's used on the TV and on all the advertisements. It's a very impressive looking graph, but it's not really reflective of what's going on clinically.
I agree. I think it doesn't tell the story, and it tells the story only in a very select subset of the data that when we start chopping up the data that much, it's not surprising that you might find something, whether or not that has any meaning. Mm-hmm. Can I ask, and this is something that we got into, I think probably in one of our first or second podcasts in our second segment, but is it fair for me to question why? I mean, this is kind of a big deal if it were to work, right? I mean, memory loss is a significant problem, and if I could take a pill that would significantly improve my memory, that would be a big deal.
I would certainly do it.
Why am I right to question why this wasn't published in
New England Journal of Medicine?
Let's say not the New England Journal, because it's a small study, but even if it were a bigger
neurology journal,
a reason. I've never heard. I'm not trying to say I know that there's something wrong with this journal, but I've never heard of it such that I wouldn't suspect that it is
first tier journal.
Certainly, my look in the literature suggests it's not maybe even the first tier journal within the subset of journals that you might publish this in. Is that fair for me to wonder that, or do you think I'm being overly critical?
Well, in some of the sort of ancillary materials I've read, it is claimed that this paper was published in a non-peer reviewed journal. But I actually contacted the journal publishers themselves, and I asked them, was this particular article sent out for peer review? And they said, yes, absolutely, of course it is. And I asked to see the peer review remarks, and they were not willing to send me the
which
the
is
peer
not
review
which
comments.
is not uncommon.
Right,
I suspect
right.
most journals wouldn't do that.
Probably not.
No harm in asking.
No, but the publisher does say that it has been peer reviewed, so one needs to take it at face value and assume that it's been sent out.
Yep.
But I think one curious thing, when I got a copy of that particular issue in which this study appears on the inside cover of the journal in full page color, is an advertisement for the product, for Prevagen. And
Are there other advertisements in this
there
journal?
are a few other advertisements.
But that is the big one, right?
That is the big one, and it's right on the inside cover. So I think that is a little bit on the dodgy side.
Yeah, it certainly feels conflicted somehow.
Yeah.
Can I raise one other issue, which is surprised me? So most journals insist on whether it's a clinical trial or an observational study, some kind of ethics statement. They insist on a statement that says this was reviewed by an ethics board, that consent was sought from patients, those sort of things. Now, they do say that they got consent, I believe. I'm pretty sure I read that. But there's no discussion of whether or not this was IRB reviewed. It doesn't appear that this trial was ever registered with the clinical trials registry, which is something that is strongly encouraged. There's no, as far as I know, there's no legal requirement to register, but it's typically done. And many journals, many of the higher tier journals will insist they won't publish a clinical trial if you haven't published in one, pre-registered your study in one of these registries. And I see no evidence of that, and I looked online and didn't find it.
Mm-hmm. However, let me just state that in that prior article that these same authors published concerning the dogs, they do state that all procedures were approved by the Facility Animal Use and Care Committee and were compliant with the guidelines of the Canadian Council on Animal Care. So they certainly did know that is something
for their preclinical study
for the animal study.
Yeah.
Okay.
But no idea how they treated their humans.
Right.
It's just
Well, they don't-
surprising to
they
me.
They don't describe it.
It surprised me they didn't describe it. It surprised me the journal didn't insist on it. That's usually fairly standard. So I'm just surprised by that. I'm not suggesting that I have any reason to believe that wasn't, IRB reviewed or anything like that. I'm just saying it's a little surprising not to see that.
Yep.
Any last comments before we move on?
Yeah, can I just mention that it's about $3 a pill for this.
I think it's $1.
Is it $1 pill? Yeah. And it's that calculates out to about $828 per year for a medication that is of
Or $365 a year
if
it's only $1 pill.
Well, $69 per bottle and 30 capsules per bottle. That's a 1 month supply, but it turns out to be about $900 a year, and the people.
I don't think so. I think it's $365 a year.
$1 a pill.
No, it's $70 a bottle, and there's 30 pills in the bottle.
Not on Amazon.
Well,
Anyway, point is, it's expensive.
It's
whatever
expensive.
It is.
Point is, it's expensive, and the point is that it is being marketed to people who, have a concern for their cognitive abilities, and I am a little concerned with that particular kind of marketing.
Yeah, I agree. It's a vulnerable population.
It is.
It's a vulnerable population, and the elderly are subject to all sorts of scams.
I think at the very least, this could be considered preliminary data, and at the very least, I would think that one would want to try to replicate this under more stringent conditions and see if, in fact,
do a proper clinical development plan, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. Let's, if this stuff is as great as they say, we should be licensing it.
I agree, and this should be if it were true, it should be replicable, and if it's as we have hinted at that it could just be this odd finding, then we'll find that out, and that would be worth knowing.
Yep.
And presumably somebody could do that, right? I mean, this is something you can buy over the counter. There's no reason somebody else couldn't set up a trial, right?
Hey, we could set up a study. It's only $90 a bottle or whatever.
All right.
We can buy some.
60.
$60. All right.
Can I just end with one comment about this study, which is, did you notice there were 2 adverse events? Mm-hmm. Neither of them were severe adverse events, but they did note 2 adverse events, one of which was a patient reported feeling owly.
Owly, yeah, I liked that.
I missed that.
Owly. Reported.
Does that mean smarter?
No, apparently it means grumpy. I actually had to go and look this up. Owly is apparently...
I've never heard that term.
I've never heard this too. This is, it means irritable, grumpy, or uncooperative. Supposedly, some person is guessing on the internet, so don't take this to mean anything, that owls have tufts of feathers above their eyes, which resemble the furrowed brow of a grumpy old man.
Wow, this is apparently what I am.
Owly. Chris is owly.
My wife
never heard
and
this
children.
Term. Never heard this term before.
Now they're going to be psyched when they
They
hear
are
this
going to be
podcast.
so psyched.
I've been, we went skiing yesterday and we were driving back. It's a long drive. And guess what we did? We listened to the podcast.
You listen to your own podcast. Well done.
I do. The kids are
Do
all
you
like,
laugh at your own jokes?
I do.
You are your own best audience.
Does anybody else listen?
No, because they were all asleep.
No correlation, huh?
But I found it very educational.
Well, you learned from you.
I learned.
Wow.
Is it possible to learn from yourself?
I doubt it. All right, let's move on. So in our second segment, we want to get into an issue that comes out of this first, but is sort of unrelated in the sense that it applies a much broader sense. So I want to talk about the ethics around doing your own research when you are going to profit from the product that you are doing research, and whether or not there is an inherent conflict of interest in there, or whether or not this is something that is, something that just we have to get over because it's the only way to actually get products tested. I mean, we should acknowledge up front that it is expensive to run randomized trials. It's expensive to do the research and development that gets you to a product in the first place. I'm talking here about largely drugs and biologics here, but this is expensive and can't necessarily be funded by Joe researcher in his lab. So is this something that we just have to live with? Is it acceptable? Is it problematic? And if so, are there guidelines that we should be following when this is true? So I want to start with you, Chris, because you are the only one of us here who's actually worked in industry. And give us your take on whether or not we should be skeptical when we see an industry-sponsored study, or whether we should just accept that that's part of the way that this business is run.
Well, so the question is not whether is there a conflict of interest when your company could benefit financially from the results of a clinical trial. That is the definition of a conflict of interest. So there's no ambiguity about this.
Okay.
There is a absolute ironclad conflict of interest around this. So the question is not whether there is one. The question is, what do you do about the conflict of interest that is inevitable? And so in the case of FDA sponsored, or FDA oversight of clinical development projects through pharmaceutical companies, the entire clinical development process is built around the understanding that there is a conflict of interest at various steps that the regulator takes in partnership or collaboration, I guess. Partnership is maybe not the right word, to mitigate the conflict that inevitably exists. And so that, would include things like the sponsor of the research, the company that's developing the product that wants to license the product, would not be allowed to do clinical trials until the FDA has provided investigative new drug approval to go ahead, and that creates a framework that allows the clinical developer to engage in clinical research, but it is not a license to go and do whatever you want. It is a license to enter into a negotiated development process with the FDA. And what that means is that your regulator will review all of your protocols before you implement them, and you will agree upon the outcomes of the study and the analysis plan and the methodology, and that the regulator will review your assays to ensure that they're valid and that they're measuring the thing that's important to measure. And they will scrutinize basically every aspect of your development plan, because there is a conflict of interest around that. And if all of those steps are taken, you can often generate valid data. But it requires a way to step away from the conflict of interest and manage that.
And who is that regulator that does that reviewing? Is that the FDA itself?
That would be the FDA in the United States or the EMA in Europe.
So personnel from the FDA, in a very detailed fashion, scrutinize all of the steps as they're progressing in the development of this new drug.
That's right, and there are key milestones in this plan. So the first milestone is that you have to present a dossier of information saying why you believe your drug or vaccine or device or whatever it is a good, safe, efficacious drug, device, or vaccine based on basic science and preclinical data in animals. And if you pass that bar, you're allowed to enter into phase 1 trials. But then each study has to be reviewed and approved by the regulator in sequence. It's not like you can then run all the trials you want. Every one of them is negotiated and every protocol is approved. And then before you can enter into large-scale, i.e. phase 3 trials, you have to go to the regulator, the FDA, and attend what's called an end-of-phase 2 meeting, which is a multi-day affair, very intense, with literally thousands of pages of documentation leading up to it, where you are intensely scrutinized, and all of the evidence you've generated to that date is inspected. And at that point, there's a risk-benefit analysis made by the regulator that says, we believe there isn't sufficient evidence to justify going into phase 3 clinical trials. And so most drugs, vaccines, and devices do not make it to the point of an end of phase 2 meeting. Most of them fail during phase 2 because they recognize that their product is not going to succeed. And so it is a very, very, very intense bilateral relationship between the sponsor and the regulator, and the entire thing is built around the ideal of mitigating the inevitable conflict of interest.
So why didn't the same thing apply to this particular product?
Because this was not an FDA-approved product. This is a health supplement, which is exempt from FDA oversight.
And does that mean that everything in the health supplement universe likewise does not fall under the same kind of scrutiny in terms of rigorously demonstrating efficacy and safety?
Generally, they have a buy from this process because they are not, and this is where they got into problems with the FTC, because as a health supplement, you can sell your product as long as it's safe, but you don't have to demonstrate efficacy. But you are not allowed to make health claims, and the company, the Quincy Biosciences, was making health claims that this is a cure for dementia. An effective treatment for dementia. That is obviously a health claim.
Yeah, I don't think they said cure for dementia.
Treatment for it.
I think it improve your cognitive ability. I don't know if I think they actually made the claim that it would be a treatment for dementia because that's a pretty wild claim. But I think by implication, they're saying that here's a pill you can take that improves memory.
Okay. So let me Don, so you've never been involved in industry sponsored research, or have you?
No, I haven't.
So do you immediately sort of downweight in your review of evidence something if you see it coming that it is industry funded, and does it change your mind if the industry funded the trial but didn't run the trial? Do you make a distinction in your mind?
Oh boy, this is such a gray area.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Chris did a really good job of sort of outlining the rigor that the pharmaceutical industry is subject to at the hands of the FDA. And I think that it needs to be said that the FDA is really one of the crown jewels in the U.S. regulatory process. They're a huge headache for the pharmaceutical industry, huge, but they have created a level of rigor that is unparalleled, and I think it's really, really important. So aside from that, I totally agree with Chris that it is the definition of a conflict of interest. So if I am to believe results of science that's generated by somebody that has the potential for a benefit, I want to see some oversight, some measure of objectivity. I want some arm's length assessment or involvement that, in fact, that there's been a judgment or an effort by an outside body that is truly unbiased and has no conflict of interest. And it's becoming more and more important all the time. Even though we don't get funded really by industry, or very rarely do we ever, we are required by the university to sign a conflict of interest form for every single research study that we do. It's a really, really fundamental and important concept.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you both said. I would just say, my level of skepticism is greater when it appears that this is research that has been actually done by industry as opposed to research that has been funded by industry.
Right.
But
I would agree with that.
But even being funded by it certainly weighs into my calculation when I try to think about what that evidence might mean. It doesn't mean I throw it out. And again, this is a real expensive undertaking. So it's probably we don't have any other alternatives. So I'm understanding of that, but it does factor into my calculations.
If I could add just one point, and I know we need to move on to the last section, is that the FDA oversight is quite effective at dealing with the conflict of interests around the studies that form the dossier, the portfolio of trials that go into licensure decisions. What that doesn't do is have any control over the publication of those studies. So those are completely delinked. So what you see published on PubMed is not necessarily reflective of what the FDA sees in its dossier. And there are examples where the difference between what the FDA sees and what ends up being published can be striking.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's. Let me just add to that, because Chris has done a nice series of investigations looking at what organizations do in fact register their clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, and once they've been registered, which they're now obligated to, how many of them actually then finished filling out that registration with the results of the study? And industry does a lot worse than academics. Is that right, Chris?
They do poorly. I actually have the study right here, so we can take a look at that. But to me, the most egregious thing that I found when this was a study I did with Hiroki Saito, and we published in PLOS One a couple of years ago, looking at transparency of industry and non-industry clinical research studies. And we found that about 30% of all studies that were done never see the light of day in terms of either putting their results on clinicaltrials.gov or publishing them in a peer-reviewed journal. And that then if you break it down into subgroups and you look at industry versus non-industry and then the phase of development, we find that systematically the industry-sponsored phase 2 trials are vastly underrepresented in the clinical literature, that the majority of those studies, not like some, but actually the majority of phase 2 studies that are initiated never get published.
Interesting. Okay, so we clearly are going to have to live with some of this, but it is important for us to keep aware of. Okay, so let me move us on to our last segment, which is our Amazing and Amusing segment, our favorite segment, in which we highlight some of the things that make us enjoy our jobs a bit more than we already do. Look at the weird, wacky stuff, or in Chris's case, I'll look at the amazing stuff that goes on in this world. Chris, you wanna take it?
Yeah. So this one really made me happy. It was a study, again, in one of my favorite journals, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Wang and colleagues. And the study is called Revealing a 5,000-Year-Old Beer Recipe in China.
Okay.
And it is exactly as what they describe. This was an archaeologic study that was also mixed with electron microscopy and some chemistry. Basically, we know that the Chinese had been growing grains since about 9,000 BCE. So it is reasonable to assume that once you have grains, you're soon enough going to have beer, because beer is basically you mix grains with water and it turns into alcohol or something horrible, but often it turns into alcohol. And so they found this dig site from one of the Yangshao era, which is between 5,000 and 2,900 BCE. And they dug it up and they found basically a complete brew kit. In pottery.
Seriously?
Yeah,
That's
so it's
fantastic.
pretty neat. They had big wide based pots,
Yeah.
right, which are not useful because they're so wide unless you are cooking mash, which is what after you malt the grains. Malting is when you add water to them and then they sprout. And then the sprouting releases enzymes that digest the starch and release simple sugars that can then be fermented. And so after you've malted it, you then mash it, which is you heat it to release all the sugar into liquid, and then you ferment it. Okay. And so these big round pots are basically mashing vessels for heating this. And they found the stoves to heat them with, too, little tripod cook stoves. And then they found funnels, which we'd use to filter the beer and get rid of all the, beer is full of sludge and hops and husks of barley and stuff you don't want to drink. So you got to filter it. And so they had clay funnels, and then these amphoras, which are narrow at the bottom. And you say, well, why does it be narrow at the bottom? What's the point of that? Because you can't stand it up, it'll fall over. But the point is that it allows the sediment to sit at the bottom and not be there when you're drinking it. So it's a convenient way of storing beer. And then, now this was all very circumstantial, but then they went and they actually found that these vessels were lined with starch granules, which showed the chemical evidence of malting and mashing, and husks of various grains, including something called, it's a beautiful thing called Job's tears, which is a kind of millet seed that can be used to making beer.
Cool.
I thought it was really cool. So beer is obviously around. We know it's been 5,000 years. Beer's been around longer than 5,000 years, but it was really neat to see this, someone's basement.
Didn't
basically.
they also find a bowl of? Didn't they also find a bowl of petrified beer nuts?
If they'd looked hard enough, they'd find some popcorn, some pretzels.
And the guy
The question is, did they serve the beer cold or room temperature? Was it refrigerated?
Probably not 5,000 years ago.
Did they find Norm?
Yeah. Anyway, it made me very happy to read this article.
Norm G.
Because we still like beer today. It's great stuff.
fantastic.
In vino veritas, but in cerveza felicitas.
Oh, jeez. I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. All right, I'm gonna take the prerogative and go next here, and you're gonna have to follow me on this one because this one is gonna jump around. Okay, so mine has to do with something, and you all know I'm famous for mispronouncing it, so you're gonna have to help me out. Presbycusis?
Presbycusis.
Presbycusis.
Goggle eyes.
Goggle eyes?
Is it something to do with your eyes?
No, presbycusis, and I didn't know what this was, so I had to look it up. Presbycusis is the process by which, over time, your ears can't hear higher pitched sounds.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, right.
And so
right.
as you age, you lose the ability to hear
The high tones.
higher pitched sounds. This is called presbycusis. Now, I didn't know how to pronounce presbycusis, so I went to one of these online pronunciation things, and I pushed the button, and it told me how to pronounce presbycusis. And then I thought, well, let me just look up Angina.
Come again?
Angina.
Angina.
Which they say
It's
is
angina.
pronounced angina
Oh, they do not.
Angina.
or
Who are they? Is this
angina in the United States.
No way.
Is this the
Boo.
Google?
This is several websites.
Not by American doctors.
I understand. They said angina in the U.S., but angina was also acceptable. Okay, so fine.
Wow.
But anyway, back to where I was. Back to where I was.
Presbycusis.
Listen back to the episode on heart stents if you want to know why that's funny. Anyway, so that came up because I was listening to Wait, Don't Tell Me, in which they were doing a story. They did a joke. One of their punchline jokes was about this app that somebody made for an iPhone called the Annoyatine. And the Annoyatine is an app that will make a high-pitched sound that is really annoying to the ears of a teenager, but adults cannot hear.
It's like a kid whistle.
Because of what did I call it?
I think this one
Wait. The reason this was interesting, again, you got to follow me on this, was because, and how does this relate to our jobs in any way, shape, or form, is the fact that about a decade ago, I was sitting in my office.
No.
And every 2 to 3 minutes, it felt like there would be this really annoying ping that would go off. And a former employee who doesn't work with us anymore, but she's gone off to other things, she and I sat there for a good hour trying to figure out what this noise was, and we couldn't.
And it was a new noise.
Because it didn't go off regularly enough for us to be able to find it. Hours later, Don Thea revealed to us a product called the Annoyatron, I believe it was.
That's right.
The Annoyatron that he had put in my office that does this, that makes this annoying.
Don did this to annoy you.
Don did this intentionally to annoy me. Okay. To wrap this up and to get back to presbycusis. So I did a little bit more digging on presbycusis. And in 2006, there was a story on NPR's All Things Considered. This is fantastic. That this guy took this idea of presbycusis, and what he did was he made a teen begone device that you could put in stores if you wanted to get rid of the teens that would play this annoying noise.
The only teens can
and
hear
only
it.
the teens can hear it, and they leave your store because it's painful. He develops the device, and kids at, I think it was his daughter's school, find out about this, record the sound or get access to the sound, and set it up as the ringtone to their phones so that when it goes off in school,
In class.
they can hear it and the teachers cannot.
So clever.
It's so brilliant.
So
It
clever.
made me so happy when I heard
Those
about
teens.
this. My kids were thrilled.
And in fact, that individual who used it at that convenience store won the Ig Nobel Prize, the
Fantastic.
Ig Nobel Peace Prize that year.
Well, I'm thinking this could really solve my cognitive decline problems because I find like having kids around all the time makes it so difficult to think.
Just keep
You
them.
turn this. This
keep
would be better
on.
than Prevagen.
There you go. There you go. Don, what do you got?
All right, I have a short one. It is it's a paper published again in the BMJ. The title by
BMJ Christmas edition or
Yes,
BMJ?
Christmas.
Got it.
Stephen Gwilyn, Dominic Howard, Nev Davies, and Keith Willett. The title of the article is Harry Potter Casts a Spell on Accident-Prone Children. So what they did is they did a retrospective, they work in an emergency room in England. They did a retrospective review of all children aged 7 to 15 who attended their emergency department with musculoskeletal injuries over the summer months of a 3-year period. And they counted the number of weekend admissions between 8 a.m. on Saturday and 8 a.m. on Monday. And they did that to include that period of time, inclusive of the launch dates of the two most recent Harry Potter books, The Order of the Phoenix and The Half-Blood Prince, were Saturday, June 21st, 2003, and Saturday, July 16th, 2005. And what they found was that there was a marked decrease in accident admissions to the emergency department on those weekends when the Harry Potter book was released.
I believe it.
That is fantastic.
Isn't that amazing?
They're not playing soccer. They're staying at home and
Yeah.
sitting in their beanbag
Yeah.
chairs.
They're
It's
not
great.
falling out of trees and.
By the way, going back to that the study we did on hockey and injuries, I was searching around, and there is a large literature of heart attacks on Super Bowl days, and looking at like the winning team versus the losing team, and who has more heart attacks, like the fans
regionally.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's like and like impact of fan enthusiasm on heart attack rates. It's quite a field.
So we should stop being fans. That's what we should do.
Apparently so. All right. Well, that's a good one. I like that one. All right. Well, so you have reached the end of our program. So if you've
wasted another 60
perfectly
minutes.
good hour.
If you have any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at PopHealthyX, or you can tweet me at ProfMattFox, or you can tweet Chris at id.gill, or Don at dthea1.
Can't guarantee we'll respond.
Oh, yes, you can. Or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website. That's www.pophealthex.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you download that next episode.
See you next time.
See you next time.